Thanks, Samara. Those were really useful comments. And I think your question about revitalization to whom, and are these changes that this part of Nashville is seeing, would they be framed as revitalization, is key. Because I mean, on a basic level, there are new businesses that replace empty storefronts. There's a stronger rental market in these areas where long-term residents were kind of dying off. Houses were going to their children who were either living in other cities or were living in other neighborhoods. So from sort of some metrics, yes, there are more businesses, the schools are full again, teachers aren't having to go house to house to try to recruit children to come into the kindergarten class. But when you start talking to the kind of different components of the neighborhood, for some long-term residents, these changes are experienced very much as a loss of seeing businesses that have different colors and they sell different things, and it's very much experienced as a loss. For new immigrants, it's very much experienced, for many of them, is this is just like being in my hometown. This is kind of a wonderful thing. Right as I was finishing the field work, there was the first sort of moment I saw of trying to bridge these two. It was in a neighborhood I didn't talk about in the presentation called Flat Rock, and it was called Hands Across Flat Rock Festival. And it was framed as being long-term residents began it, and their explanation was, we need a way to acknowledge their diversity and our history. And that was really the language that was used. And it was the first instance where a neighborhood association of some sort was able to have immigrant and long-term resident participation. So both kind of came together, and it was in actually one of the local parks where a lot of immigrants sort of were hanging out anyway. So there are, this question of like, will it ever be seen as revitalization, maybe on a long enough timeline. And it's certainly, when you mentioned Nashville needing Chicanos, they're about 13 now. So who knows if children born to Mexican parents in Nashville, are they going to identify as being Chicano? Are they going to identify as Mexican American? Will they see themselves as Southern? All of these questions are up in the air. But as they age out, I think those claims to place will get much stronger.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, actually. I think it would help me answer it if I tell you the other kind of work that I'm doing. So right now in Oregon, I'm focusing on a small town called Woodburn. A lot of the people there have work in agriculture and eat their pineros, so in the tree planters. Okay. And in Woodburn, you have Main Street that's, I don't know, 90% of the businesses are Latino businesses. I've never seen anything like that in a rural town. It's really amazing, like 5 blocks of Latino small businesses. There's a lot of conflict, so there's a lot of resistance there, especially from the historical preservationists that want to see Woodburn be redeveloped pre-Mexican, or they don't say that, but it's 50 years ago or something. But anyways, so there you can really see the clashes. I think in MacArthur Park you get a different story. Yes, there's been a lot of, it's been contested, but I think MacArthur Park is like, it's kind of an abandoned community. And what I mean by that is that it was never abandoned by the Latinos that lived there, but it was abandoned by the city institutions in the mid-80s and 90s. It always served a specific function, though, like related to drugs and having very kind of affordable housing, all this stuff. But then the city institutions started to pay attention to the community, and they wanted to revitalize it. I think a lot of that pressure was coming from the downtown revitalization. That's MacArthur Park was the first subway station stop outside of the central business district, and so really the planners back in the mid 80s, late 80s, they were thinking of changing the community. So I think the contestation was really there, and I think it's a story of how different players within the community that represented the Latino interests. So whether they were community-based organizations, religious organizations, or local politicians that saw it in their best interest to maintain the Latino community, basically fought off all those other pressures for displacing the area. So I think it's a different kind of story. But if I could speak a little bit to the definition of revitalization. So I look at it from a planning perspective. So urban revitalization is really the kind of the placement of various resources to bring economic kind of changes to the area. So and And if you take that kind of definition, I think it kind of misses the point that we're discussing here in the class, that it's really, well, was it for who? You know, how do you do more, you know, organic, generative, bottom-up revitalization that actually improves the lives of the individuals that live in those communities? So in Woodburn, it's fascinating because, you know, there's people that are doing all that revitalization, but you know, city officials and others, they don't really appreciate it. You know, they want to diversify the downtown. And what they mean by that is, I don't know, they want to bring you in Starbucks and they want to bring you these things, you know. So I think there's this key question here about you know, who's this revitalization for, and what are the political economic interests behind the institutions that have the power to impede in these environments.
Well, and just to build on that, you know, some local cities talk about the immigrants taking over abandoned business areas as revitalization, and then some don't. Some sort of form it as a problem. So I'll just sort of moderate the questions. Maybe you can ask several at a time, like last time. Okay, so here, here, and then here.
Yeah, I'm just so thrilled to have heard you talk about transit-oriented development in such a human way. Where I come from, transit-oriented development is used to create an economic engine for the for the county or the city. I will identify the city as Washington, D.C., and the current county as Montgomery County. And so transit-oriented development is a way to take the subways, totally change the housing, and right now the market everyone wants is millennials who will turn over, but they won't be there. So it seems to me so much of what you have to say is about how long people live in an area, take ownership of an area, and have legitimacy in an area, to be seen as legitimate residents. And in some respects, then, this, in my mind, gets back to immigration reform and how that creates more security for people who are first and second and third generation with, you know, documents. So I'm so thrilled that you brought this all up.
Great, thank you.
Second, go ahead.
Yeah, terrific panel. I have kind of a demographic question, I guess, particularly for Jamie's favor. I think the phenomenon of looking at immigration inflows into areas in the South and the Midwest and so forth is so fascinating for the reasons you stated and its prior histories and so forth. One of the things I was thinking of and I'm just curious about is the structural situation, that is to say, I didn't get a good sense of like what the proportion of immigrants are now, but for example, in some of these neighborhoods. And the reason I ask is I'm curious with whether the reception and some of these issues about identity is conditional on the simple group size. I mean, there's no literature, of course, classic literature showing and so forth in terms of tipping points when it comes to racial composition and reception and how or when people will move, and that's been contested, but nonetheless there's a lot of good research on that, and that raises the question in my mind, what are there, quote, tipping points with regard to immigrant reception, right? So in other words, did the King Ridge, was it because it reached a certain point, would it have been reception and quote, integration, more reception if it was below a certain population? These are just questions, right? Because I don't get a good sense of what the immigrant context is in terms of the demography of it. And I think this is going to be really important as we think about other areas that have not had the immigrant flows like they have in the past.
No, it's one more, right here.
Yeah, my question will be tied back again to affordable housing. You seem to be knowledgeable about it. So the point she made in terms of how to generate ownership within a community, and the American dream is predicated on home ownership. So where is home ownership in affordable housing? Is that part of, again, when you look at it? And then the other thing you mentioned with regard to, you know, political and cultural and human resources basically within the area to be able to catalog that basically, again, back to demographics. what do you use to look at that? I mean, and how do you visually represent it? I've seen some GIS systems that, policy map and now allows you to overlay things and allows politicians who would not understand this information to see it in a visual way that they've never been able to see before. And so the academics that are asking these questions, we should be presenting it to them in a fashion that they're going to be able to receive it, i.e. a map with color overlays and all that stuff. So what do you do to get the information? How do you represent it in a way that you're going to gain the political support necessary to do this work?
That's a great question. Okay, so I'll start with the last question. Okay, so first of all, I should say I'm a qualitative researcher. Okay, so I would say I'll answer the question in two levels. One is, okay, I take a qualitative approach. So, but at the same time, I see the usefulness of having visual data and quantifying it and so forth. That's one. The other thing is, I work with a lot of undocumented or unauthorized populations, and so kind of trying to count those populations or somehow quantify those populations is very difficult. What's interesting though is in MacArthur Park, MacArthur Park it's also an area that has a high level of unauthorized population. So for me, the interesting question there is, why is it that the local politicians were able to still kind of intervene the way they did, even though they weren't directly getting the votes from that population? And when I would ask this question to them, they kind of knew, like they knew that there was a lot of undocumented people there, but somehow they still felt, because of the economic, mostly economic actually, the economic resources that community was providing to, in terms of developing new businesses and all that, that they could still directly benefit from that population. So a lot of times when I interview different politicians and different planners, they would say that you have to think about MacArthur Park as and I'll put, this is what they would say, like third world nation, where it's a lot of little wallets making a big difference, and that the cumulative effect. So you could look at it from a I guess you could sell it to politicians from that perspective. Say, okay, that there's that financial incentive that the immigrants kind of had. So I think the home ownership situation, I didn't specifically look at that. I think that's a really good point. MacArthur Park is mostly, it's a high density area, mostly apartments. People that actually own those buildings are many times absentee kind of landlords. So I think it would be difficult to actually have people own the property there. So there's those other layers that kind of.
I think that's the key, though. Some type of community co-op where they, are buying into the space.
Right.
And it's cheap, it's subsidized, and then when they leave, the next, because they've got a little bit more, they get bought out, it gives them the next day to move forward.
Yeah, I'll tell you another story about MacArthur Park, just briefly. So when they wanted to do the TOD, the MTA went and they basically tried to buy some of the surrounding buildings in the area, but the buildings looked pretty run down. I mean, but the owners wanted a lot of money. The MTA felt that they were asking for it.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe the owners actually, maybe they were making so much profit off of that because it's a big market there. So there's something, I always go back to this issue of informality and how state institutions and how planners work with that. I think there's no simple way of doing it.
It's a great question, Rob. To be honest, I'm not sure I have the data from the kind of work I've done to answer, but let me think out loud a little bit. At the level of census tracts in 2010, there were some sites in that quadrant that were above sort of 35% Hispanic. Now, when you get within those census tracts, what you found were in the northern part, which was sort of 1920s and 30s neighborhoods, the small houses, they're sort of close together, you were seeing some streets become predominantly Latino or predominantly Hispanic, with some holdouts of long-term residents who you couldn't blast them out of those houses. The other thing that you saw is when you got into sort of the more southern part of that and you got past the garden apartments and you got into bigger apartment complexes, a lot of those had become almost exclusively foreign-born. So it was both Hispanic immigrants and also refugees. And there I did hear stories of people, especially young teachers in the other part, who had moved into these apartment complexes in the early 2000s and moved out in response to the fact that the whole apartment complex had become Mexican. So you saw some there. But in terms of thinking about this tipping point, one of the things that I saw a lot in interviews with long-term residents across that area is people asking, okay, well, are there immigrants settling in your neighborhood? No, my neighborhood doesn't have any. 2 streets over, yes, it's entirely foreign-born. And so there were these really fine-grained distinctions that people were making to sort of separate their own sense of my neighborhood's not changing, but just a street over is, but I don't view that as my neighborhood. I think in the Cane Ridge case, if you actually look at the demographics of that area in comparison to the demographics of the overall Antioch area, they're quite similar. But it was the visibility of it was the speed of change, and it was the visibility of this new population who would do things like stand at the bus stop, right? And this is a part of the city where people don't use public transportation. So seeing a bunch of people standing at that bus stop, and which is very close to this apartment complex, that kind of visibility, I think, plays into this. But this is a key question that we now are starting to have enough data to begin to think, like, does the tipping point look different in a new destination? And how would it compare to kind of what we know about those black-white relationships in terms of neighborhood turnover?
If I could add, so I just wanted to add something to the definition again of revitalization. So I think about this a lot, actually. So I look at it in 2 ways. There's the regulative revitalization and there's the generative revitalization. The regulative revitalization is really the state's intervention to change the social structures in these neighborhoods. And you have to understand the political economic interests behind the state and how they're trying to change it. And the generative revitalization is more of the informal, kind of bottom-up efforts that people in spaces use to kind of lay legitimacy and claim to their spaces.
Okay, here, and then here.
I like your attention to narrative. And I wanted to ask about 2 narratives that I think exist and where we might take it next. One of the first ways that the arrival of Nazi Latinos was narrativized was as more or less they're not white. So that lots of folks attributed particular criminal, especially behaviors, drug behaviors to them, regardless of the facts on the ground, which were not in place, because I think they sort of thought of them as analogous to black people. And that exists still sometimes. Then there's sort of a successive narrative that's also pernicious, in which they're defined as not black, right? That these immigrants are so good, they're building businesses, boy, they're great. And the implicit statement there, sometimes from the immigrants themselves, is, brown good, black bad, right? Why couldn't black people do this? And I wondered sort of how the narratives emerge in your discussions with people, and then sort of going off on a level, what's the narrative that we should be aiming at? Because however we present our empirical research, there are particular things that folks hear, and you have to be really careful not to play into a particular different kind of updated but still racist narrative.
Well, I can speak to this, or you guys can use it.
Oh, both of you.
So, the interesting thing about the motivating factor that got me into this research, I have horses, and I was at a feed shop in rural Kentucky in the late 90s, and I was talking to some farmers, and they were saying, we have new workers. New people are working in our tobacco farms. Oh, and where are they from? Well, I said, well, who are your workers? Well, I don't rightly know how to describe them. As at this point was unaware that we were beginning to see Latino migration in this area, and finally, I guess they're Mexican. And there was actually not a way to describe this group, and that has shown up in other people's research. In Helen Morrow's work in rural North Carolina, Angie Spees has done some really interesting work in northern Mississippi, where the first wave of immigrants were conflated with Native Americans. who there was a small population close by, and she has these really interesting stories of doing interviews with rural residents, rural black residents, of thinking, well, we thought they were Indians until we heard them speak. And we realized that's not a Native American language, that's Spanish. So some of those dominant narratives that we think of for immigration at the beginning of this sort of settlement weren't in place in these areas. But you're right about the kind of racial distancing from African Americans. I mean, I certainly saw that in interviews in the early 2000s with service providers. You certainly saw it with employees, and it's shown, or employers, and it's shown up in other people's research as well, among Latino residents themselves. It showed up in the research I did, again, in Helen Morrow's work. Paula McLean has seen this in some big comparative studies in different cities where Latino residents have very quickly figured out that it's not the black-white binary, it's the black-not-black binary that carries the most weight. And in terms of thinking about where we can intervene in this, I think one of the things that's important is to continue to drive home the way that in these kinds of sort of emerging racial hierarchies or negotiations, that there's an evacuation of white responsibility. That race becomes something that these two groups have to sort out. And that's really the focus on black-brown dynamics, that they have to sort these issues out. And in the process, kind of the structural racism and white privilege that keeps this system going really falls out of the picture. I think that, for me, that's an important thing. You know, with the comparison of immigrants and busing, like there's a story of white privilege embedded in both of those narratives. It's important to keep a focus on.
So yeah, just really quickly, I think that the narrative really depends on the local context of deception. So in my work in Iowa, I don't know, maybe this seems, but it was really like a welcoming kind of narrative. And I think it's because I was kind of understood. I mean, there were, the Latino community was working in the meatpacking industry, okay? So they understood that, their towns were kind of dying, and they need the labor and stuff. So even though there was this kind of tension as well, I think at least from what I was able to take, it was very kind of this welcoming kind of narrative. I think in Oregon it's very different. Oregon is this narrative of invisibility, like within this really racialized kind of climate. So Latinos there have been pretty much been a migratory labor force before Oregon was like a state. I mean, and so it goes back, 100 years. And now Latinos are trying to make a sense of place there, and so you have a lot of racial kinds of tension. So I think like ways forward, what I saw in MacArthur Park is almost like this hybridity of culture, not only of immigrants, but within like immigrant kind of culture. So the different Central American nations coming in and trying to start something new like this. Sometimes I call MacArthur Park like the Mesoamerican capital of the world. And so I think it's this issue of like hybridity of cultures, of adaptation between cultures, of paying attention to cultural difference and respecting that difference, and building something new out of that.
There was a question here and then here.
I think building a little more on the tipping point idea, do you see examples of sort of the tipping point going in the opposite direction from a political perspective, when a message is sort of sent as there's going to be increased policing or hostility, or I know whole towns in the South and the agricultural regions really hollowed out when local government sort of upped collaboration with ICE or things like that. So do you see it going both ways?
Can we take this one here too?
So I was really happy to see the title of your presentation as immigrant-led development, and I'm wondering to what extent you have shared your research with policymakers who I think really need to hear the message that this work is going on organically and purposefully, and they may not be recognizing it.
I could speak to the policing issue, and Amanda can certainly speak to this. So I started field work on this project a month after Nashville began the Trading 7G program. And so what we saw is just communities really hunker down, especially at the very beginning when all these rumors were flying about, the police can stop you at any point, and that actually turned out to be quite true in some cases, not really knowing the full story. So I think you're right that right after that, there was an English-only law that was trying to be passed in Nashville. And if you think about 2007, 2008, the just really harsh national level discourse around kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. What my sense is that a lot of immigrants really pulled life in. And so things that would have been public or might have taken place in public spaces in the city or parks or on the streets or outside in your neighborhood really came in as people kind of hunkered down. And then on top of that, you have the financial crisis. So it was like this double whammy that really hit communities quite hard, and it just made them much less visible. And it made a lot of the organizations working with immigrants just constantly trying to put out fires, like much bigger fires, and trying to create dialogue in the neighborhoods. I think you're right, it had kind of the opposite effect.
Yeah, just so quickly, like I guess a lot of my applied work actually deals with public participation issues and how to get people involved in the planning process. And I think this relates to the MacArthur Park work, but also to your question about the kind of the context of anti-immigrant and undocumented kind of workers. So I have a project right now where I directly focus on doing public engagement in unauthorized communities. And it's very difficult to do that in a very public setting. And basically my strategy is to actually go to the communities themselves and to where they work, live, play, worship, and actually set up these very non-coercive ways of engaging them. I won't get into the details of what the method is. But from that, then get their information and get them involved in the planning process in a very kind of, in a very, not in a covert way, but in a way that doesn't put them at more risk. So that's my applied work.
Here, and then over there.
I just wanted to pick up on the idea of narrative and thinking about the busing and the black-white dynamic coloring how whites in your area see what's going on, and wondering if there isn't a new narrative emerging now in which undocumented status is now coming to define Latino identity for many whites and seeing everything kind of through that prism, and the degree to which you might have seen that.
You know, I think one of the things about the field work I did is it was really catching, one of the things about New Destinations is you're constantly catching some process and formation. Every phase of an immigrant experience is the first. So, the first of U.S.-born immigrant children going into schools. And so in 2007, there were some people who were mobilizing the kind of discourse of legality, but it wasn't the lens through which this issue was being seen, in part because, again, these are white, working class neighborhoods where immigration has only recently become an issue. I think if I went back now and did the same kind of interview, that national discourse has worked its way into local explanations. I think you're right that narrative is going to change, that frame is going to change over time.
Yeah, if I could address that really quickly. One of my other projects was in Postville, Iowa, where I traced the transnational connections between immigrants that got deported there. There was about 400 immigrants. It's one of the larger rates in U.S. history. So I went to Guatemala, to the communities where they got deported, and interviewed people and identified the transnational kind of links that unauthorized workers use. But anyways, I've been really immersed in this community. And yeah, mostly other Latinos in Postville, this is a town of 2,000 people, were undocumented. They deported about half of those, so it really led to a lot of disruptions in the town as well. So for me, I think that narrative is okay, because I think it needs to be addressed. I think we're at a critical time where, immigration policy, seems like it gets going and it kind of backs off, so I think the more attention that can be drawn to that, the better. Okay, that's like a practical thing, but I can see how other Latinos that are not, that can be offended by this.
There's a policing that becomes a problem.
Right.
There's a question there. Go ahead.
I don't know if you know Mrs. Monique is Albanian immigration. And I live in a working class neighborhood. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was substantial immigration from Albania. And apparently there are different groups that we had not even realized. And I'm a kind of newcomer to the neighborhood myself. But it was very interesting, the culture of the Albanians. First of all, some of people that were different culture and a different ethnic background than the residents said, but if you like anything about this neighborhood, it's the Albanian origin. And they are very entrepreneurial. They came in, looked for opportunities, and fixed up houses, whatever. And as soon as they felt they had done well enough, they moved out. And they moved out like en masse, I mean, it's just amazing. And they may have held onto some of the properties, rental properties, but they themselves don't want to live because they felt that the local white working class were holding them back. And they were discriminating against the kids in schools and so on. And in opinion about this is white, as can be there. And it was kind of interesting process to see. And then when you looked into the Albanian community and so on, you could see different clans in there and different issues like some people who might have been a police captain in the original moved to scare the rest of the Albanian out of the woods, but anyway, they moved on and they have not shed any tears, but moving on. So that was kind of fantastic. And the neighborhood now is very much gentrified. And I can see the influence of the Albanians themselves. Taking rundown houses, fixing them up with their labor and so on.
We'll take one last question. The gentleman who's had his hand up several times.
Thank you very much for this question. I wonder if there's sort of continuing this conversation around narrative a little bit. Thinking about media as both a reflection and a shaper of these conversations and the differences between your two cases, which have historical roots, but I think there's also media plays a role here, because in the Los Angeles context, there's both local and Spanish language media, but also on the pages of the LA Times, the local news, the kind of big mainstream media, having conversations about Latino identity and Latino culture. I would imagine those kinds of conversations don't happen in quite the same way in the Nashville context. And so just have sort of an open question about what role is media playing here, and have you seen the narrative shaped or reshaped by media flows, both at a larger level and in the local or ethnic media context?
I think media representations played a key role in the area that I was looking at, especially in terms of putting some of these neighborhoods on the map as where immigrants in the city live, because Southeast Nashville is bordered by interstates and a lake. So if you didn't grow up there, you just drive by it. So most people living in the city spend no time there. So when the city's main newspaper does front page stories of Woodbine is Nashville's little Mexico, look at all these Mexican restaurants, look at this change, that community suddenly becomes visible in a way that really contradicts how long-term residents see this place. They see this as the heart of salt of the earth, white, working class Nashville. Media played a role there, and certainly in the remapping of places like Cane Ridge. You heard over and over, every time Antioch is in the news, it's a crime, it's a murder, it's something, and so that represent that sort of conflation of this place and criminal activities or gangs or a mall that nobody wanted to go to certainly shaped. They were certainly motivating factors for the ways that long-term residents were trying to redefine what this place meant.
And just it seemed the voice of the immigrant community is not coming through.
No.
In a way that I think in Los Angeles, in the MacArthur Park situation, it does in really dramatic and important ways.
So I've actually met with Monica Lozano, who's the owner of La Opinion. And so that's like a ethnic media, multi-million, I don't know, whatever, but it's a very kind of powerful media outlet. And I think that shows the difference between MacArthur Park and the other communities I study. So like in Oregon and Iowa, there the ethnic media and it is present actually, but it's a little bit more kind of, not underground, but it really serves like an immigrant integration purpose. Okay, they have these little ethnic newspapers that have stories about community events, about what's going on in the community. So it's, there's different layers, I guess, of that.
Part of what has happened, and this I think happens in a lot of new destinations, there is an institutional gap between organizations, grassroots and otherwise, that speak for and represent the neighborhood. This is our place, this is what we do, and institutions that represent communities. So you have in Nashville organizations that work with refugees and immigrants, but it's not place-based. So representations of Antioch, that's not their fight. Then you have neighborhood-based organizations that are getting lots of encouragement from the city, which is trying to put forth drawing on new urbanism, neighborhood-based governance, and they are speaking for the place. Well, immigration and immigrant settlement, you talked about community. If immigrants living in multiple neighborhoods who may or may not see themselves as part of a community, who are being represented by organizations that are talking about the international community. And so these kinds of issues just fall between the cracks. It's just this institutional gap in terms of how the city and discourse is organized.
So we only went 4 minutes over.